Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you to OhioExopolitics. I'm your host, Mark Snider, and we've got a fascinating show planned for you this evening. And I'll be speaking with a man named James Horak. James Horak shares with Earthbound humans his knowledge of man's off-planet origins, and he gives us a refined cosmology to educate and free humanity from control and tyranny. He explains the task-driven purpose of the EMVs, electromagnetic vehicles, extracting surplus energy from our sun, and he reveals how ET civilizations are helping us prevent total annihilation of our species and the Earth. James, well, I'm glad to have you back on the show, and I'd like to start back at what you've called the origin of the human race, and I've heard you say that the human race originated on a planet with 4 moons and 2 suns, and it was called the Place of Peace. Can you tell us about that?
Well, actually, it was a multi-planet civilization that had 2 suns and had gone into trying to manage their 2 stars and would not join an extended community, which would have helped them because they were renowned for their self-sufficiency and very proud of it. So as they began to work on developing what we have in our system, a solar anvil, they started having problems, and some of their more erudite scientists knew that it might be a good idea to send a contingent under the premise of colonizing another system, that in case things didn't work out. And that was a good idea, so they gathered together the materials to make a craft out of the moon. And because it had all the minerals, it had all the resources that they needed and the machinery. And so they sent off for a 300-year trip. And it didn't get halfway before the home system just became oblivion. And that's what happens sometimes when you are too self-sufficient and trying to do something that you've seen others succeed at, but not understanding all the nuances you need in order to do it safely.
I've also heard you state that when we were on this planet, we breathed helium. Can you tell us about that?
Well, it was part of the respirant gases. It was in your atmosphere. Of course, you had reached a level of technology your ancestors had where they could create and engineer ideal conditions. It was a radical jump to go as far as they were going, but they had established a great deal and were thousands of years ahead of where humans are here on this planet today. And your ancestors had unified consciousness. They had a more ideal perspective. They had longer life expectancy, much longer. They had no disease, no famine, and a very egalitarian system, and did not have anything like this elitist system that we have here.
Did we have the same physiology that we do now?
Yes. It was, unified consciousness does affect the appearance. It does make a difference. For instance, the blondes have unified consciousness. It affects their appearance. They're more robust, have more sculpted torsos, very beautiful people. But that doesn't mean that we're any less so. It just means simply that we have less variation. So beauty is almost a sense of form that we grow to expect as a standard, and it's relative.
And I have heard you say that you also lived a life on this original planet. Can you tell us more about your life on this world?
Well, I didn't, but I am familiar with the problems that came about when you came into this system and established yourself on Mars, and you put your moon around Mars first. And was dealing with the people that helped you, that had already established themselves so far in advance of where your ancestors were and in most AT civilizations that they were ready to ascend to a state of spiritual technology, and did. They were a very elegant people, and they helped you establish on Mars, and then when you made a mess there, they helped you establish on Earth. Without them, you could not have established on Earth.
So we brought what is currently our moon first to Mars, and did that help rejuvenate Mars?
Yes. Mars was very much like it was now, which didn't make any difference at the time to the Druze, because they lived an existence that was nearing spiritual. And to this day, many of their machines are still functioning beneath the surface of Mars. And that's what Bielek talks about, that they access to some extent, and what Tesla accessed to some extent after he had created ball lightning. He found that ball lightning was a useful portal to communicate through. And the first thing that he established was communication with this hall of machines.
The Druze, were they humanoid?
I wouldn't call them that. If you were allowed to go among them, they wore a very silvery suit that was tight-fitting, in which compressed in this energy field that they inhabited. If the suit came off, you were almost be blinded by the energy field that the mind and soul had combined to form the spirit. And they were nearing a period where they were going to go into spiritual technology in whole, as their entire civilization, so that they did not lose their heritage. And this is very rare, but it occurs, and it's a great privilege to see it transition. And I wish I could have watched it more closely.
So the Druze were nearly light beings? They were almost purely spiritual at this point?
Well, when any form of sentient life dies, they merely lose their mortal shell. And the soul and the mind come together in an energy field. Your mind exists as an energy field extraneous to the brain anyway. So it's not that much of a jump, and I found examples where there were people that had had such massive brain damage that they virtually had no brain above the brainstem. And yet, not only did they have all the cognitive ability before they had had this injury or whatever happened to them, but they had more. In a spectacular case that I found documented in one of these public broadcasts, it was either PBS, the Discovery Channel, or the History Channel. I found this documentary about this UN officer who was a native North African who had lost all of his brain above the brain pan, and in the brain pan and above the brain stem had become a veritable genius, learned all these African dialects, got a commission as a colonel in the UN, and was discovered when the UN was making a promo film on this relief effort to North African nation that he headed up. Wind blew his beret off, and there the old side of his head was caved in. And the excitement over it was not over how can he function, but, oh, wow, there is a sign of Stone Age trephining. So all these anthropologists got excited to track down this particular individual shaman who had administered this Stone Age brain surgery. And it turned out to be a fascinating documentary. It followed this team when they went all the way to find this village and to talk to this shaman and ask him how many of these operations he had performed. Now, they had all been performed because there had been damage to the head. These people still conducted ceremonial warfare, and every once in a while somebody get smacked in the head or fall out of a tree or whatever, and they were too far in the bush to get immediate attention. So he would operate, remove the bone from the brain and remove what brain was suffering enough lesion that the blood loss was destroying tissue, and maybe have to perform an operation over and over again. But the interesting thing about it was that instead of, like in modern medicine, where a brain surgeon prepares you to expect the worst, he would prepare you to expect the best. And that's what you get. The power of expectation is that strong.
Wow, that's very interesting. I want to get back to the moon. So at one point, we brought the moon to Mars, and then that rejuvenated Mars. And at some point, via the moon, we left Mars and came to the Earth, and now we're on the Earth. Now, you have had past lives. Did you come on the moon as well?
No. I'm busy doing other things. I'm not an ET. I'm associated with the EMVs. They've been my home for so long that I try to remember back any other environment. And all I can remember is that I'm very young. I don't have much more ability than to be able to crawl, and I'm on this floor that has convexity to it. It's like chrome, kind of cool. And I can remember that. And I remember something like a soft voice. That's going back is the earliest memories that I have. I don't have a memory of a different people or a different anything else. Everything else is I'm involved with the EMVs. I'm a liaison between them and ETs. And I'm not treated the same way. I'm kind of an appendage of the EMVs myself.
So I think maybe it's a good idea for me now to introduce Dr. Norman Berggren. Dr. Norman Berggren was an alumni, or is an alumni, of the Ames Research Laboratory and the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. He worked 12 years as a research scientist and was involved in many other things. He's a well-respected scientist at NASA, and he's written a book called The Ringmakers of Saturn. I want to read a little section of this book. It's pretty amazing. Evidence is 100% positive that the propulsive vehicles generate the inner and the outer A rings of Saturn. Presence of these units is made fortuitously clear in plates 5 and 8. Ordinarily, emissions are so profuse and chameleonic in character that recognition is rendered quite different. Recognition also is hindered by different modes of vehicle operation, which produce strangely diverse appearances. In absolute size, these mobile bodies are unearthly large. So, James, this is a really incredible statement from a NASA scientist. Can you comment on that?
Well, Dr. Berggren was an imagist for Ames, very well respected, had just about every honor that the scientific associations in aeronautics could give him. And he noticed that what astronomers had been calling migrating moons, and that's a contradiction in terms. Yeah, but you know, when science comes up against anomalies, they throw a label on them and shelve them. They don't do anything to try to resolve them or whatever, and I've always said that an anomaly is the clue to the next step up. Of course, the scientists, I don't blame them. They are under constraints, and astronomers and astrophysicists, when they make new discoveries, or they find out something peculiar with respect to planetoid structure that hasn't been cataloged, they have to submit this for review. It's not peer review. They submit it to what's called the Office of Astronomical Telegrams. These people, whoever they are, the dark, nebulous, whatever, they decide whether it'll be published or not. And no astronomer, they want to keep their job or stay in their profession, can produce anything that is new without submitting it to these people for their approval. And they have to have their approval before it's released. There's so many things that have been discovered and so many things that have been known in the past that have amounted to having records compiled, like transient lunar phenomena, like the reports of physical features on Mars that were observed until the mid-30s, 1930s, like the green canals, the Italian astronomer named Canali, and it's just endless. It's endless. Constraint is the big thing. I mean, information control has been an obsession since the industrial age, when they discovered, that the cartels had to have protection. They had to control technology so that somebody didn't come up with something that put a big corporation out of business. It reached preposterous extents. Edison, for instance, didn't want to transmit electricity by alternating current. He wanted to use direct current, and it was preposterous, and Tesla tried to talk some sense into him. Hey, I can convert this direct current into alternating current. You can go up a building and do more than just light a light bulb. And Edison wouldn't listen to him. He made a deal with Tesla and then cheated him out of the money he was supposed to pay him for doing what he did. This sort of thing set Tesla back. Tesla tried to get even with J.P. Morgan over that one, when J.P. Morgan was his benefactor. So one thing after another, containment and control has been the obsession of the industrialists. They passed it on through the government and through financial institutions to science. Until today, what we have is filtered discovery. We have filtered interpretation. We have filtered data, which is all that we have. I mean, we don't have the truth about much of anything if it changes the perspective that they have fed us.
Let me read another passage from Ringmakers of Saturn. This physically inherent mobile capability is justification for calling the body a vehicle. The body diameter can be deduced to be 1,730 miles. This distance is about the same as the airline distance from San Francisco, California to St. Louis, Missouri. Such an immense propulsive body implies a space engine possessing unheard of capacity and capability. Dr. Berggren is describing one of these gigantic crafts that are located in the rings of Saturn, and I wondered if you could comment on that, James.
Well, he was basing this mostly on two EMVs, one at each termini of the A ring as they were finishing it or completing it. And had he still been working on analyzing the EMVs when it became evident they were in the sun, I think that he would have modified his views. I did one time bring that up. I said they will be seen in the sun. And he said, how do you know that? And I couldn't lie to him, and at the same time I was put in a position of having to stand up because I wanted him to take in consideration that they were there. And so finally he said, how do you know this? How do you know this? Kept on. Finally I just said, I'm not from here. And of course he's a scientist, very pragmatic. I respect the man and have never said a negative word about him. He has done far more for science obtaining the truth about phenomena of magnitude than Copernicus, than Galileo Galilei, and so many people that we look upon today as greats that have advanced science. He's done more than all of them put together, because he has broken through this mythological cosmology that has been erected from thousands of years of tradition and myth to how and what forces are necessary and what design is essential to having a solar system that can afford complex life and environment.
So these EMVs are building the rings of Saturn, correct?
Yes. The rings are very important to the preparation of re-enriching a planet that has gone through what the Earth is going through now, or starting life on a planet, because what they take is they take the rock from a planet and pulverize it and set it into a very rarefied atmosphere, or in the case of Saturn, in orbit outside the atmospheres or the spheres of Saturn, so that cosmic bombardment will break it down, and it's almost like digesting the mineral content to where it is beneficial to tissue. This, in conjunction with a fungus that is rapacious, will create a type of life, a beginning of life, that'll feed anything and provide energy, biological energy, for anything that comes along into the mix after that.
So the minerals and the material from these rings are returned to planets and act as a kind of fertilizer for all life. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, it permits soil to start forming. Basically, what it'll do is that soil is produced by microbial reaction as they begin to ingest what this fungus and this mineral that had been digested by cosmic bombardment, so that it can provide everything that's needed to sustain life, produce oxygen, and other elemental gases that are very important for a number of processes that geophysicists today are just beginning to understand.
So every solar system with life has a Saturn-like planet then, correct?
No, it may come from another system. You have to understand that an EMV can be of different sizes. If one were to load up and bring a load of this material to Earth, it'd black out the sun over half the planet. You know, this happened in this lineage, but of course it was so long ago that accounts of it are not exactly accurate. But the last stump of this was in Nevada, and that's where this mineral is found today. And is the reason why California now produces the finest wine in the world, because of this mineral. They use it in their vineyards. But the North American Indians, when they were sick or ill, would just take it off the ground and eat it. So it's an extraordinary mineral. It has, an interesting thing about it, it has almost every elemental mineral that occurs in nature in it. It has arsenic. It has aluminum. It has everything that you would think would be a contaminant, would be toxic, but it is in a form that's efficacious to tissue. And whatever might be stored might be harmful is thrown off. So it has no downside. I've told people that have tried it and recommended it to them, just don't use it as a supplement, use it therapeutically, because it is so good that it will make the organs in your body lazy. So it's something that you use when you're having a condition. I cured hypertension with it. And if you don't have hypertension, you don't have strokes, you don't have heart attacks, you know.
Yeah, very interesting. I want to read another passage from his book here, and he's talking about a vehicle that has some kind of arm on it, and he describes it as this. He says, this bulge appears to be a donut-shaped formation or toroid through which the arm passes. Presence of a toroid indicates that the arm is acting as a conductor carrying electricity. Do you know anything about this arm that appears to be a part of some of these craft?
Oh, yes. First of all, I like to say this, Mark. I'm very impressed with your reading the book closely. I'm very impressed, and I appreciate it. The EMVs have a viable option to create appendages that are specialized in their function. They're task-driven, and they're geometrically designed appendages that are in the sun right now that are associated with the EMVs. They could not operate without the presence of the EMVs. The EMVs are necessary to protect them. But EMVs do not have a sentience. They have an awareness, and they communicate, and they have a form of intelligence, but it's not cognitive like yours. They communicate with emotion, but you can be surprised what you can communicate with emotion. Streamed emotion is an incredible, when you can bring someone to feel what you feel, it is a high level of communication, almost spiritual.
And when you're reading Dr. Berggren's book, it seems there's no doubt in his mind that these are craft that appear in the rings of Saturn. He never mentions that they might be natural objects.
Well, he wasn't aware they were in the sun. If he had been aware that they would be found in the sun, I think that he would have given them another dimension. If he had realized that they provide an explanation for why stars don't burn out, you know, and why planets and stars are round. They provide they suggest, let me say, many of the solutions to the quandaries that science has and won't broach anymore if they ever did, because they simply don't have a leg to stand on trying to explain them. But if you have the grasp on a cosmology that this is designed, that these things don't happen by accident, it's not a matter of just extending time and process out indefinitely. Everything changes.
He also talks about in his book that sometimes there's exhaust associated with these crafts. Have you heard him talk about
effluvium. That? Yeah, he calls it effluvium. Yeah, and the stringers and so forth. I'm very enamored. he also talks about places on the moon that he feels are where EMVs attach themselves. But, of course, they haven't done that in a very, very long time, and that was way back in another system long before your ancestors existed. So, the interesting thing is, you were talking about Lemuria, and you were talking about Mu and Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
Many of these are so old that they're almost pushed out of being relevant, and they're coming to you via collective consciousness and genetic knowledge, or genetic memory. And it may not have had anything to do with Earth, or it had something to do with Earth so many millions of years ago that it borders on some of the anomaly that is in Forbidden Technology, Corso's book, or the gentleman's name. Things like where they find a spark plug in a lump of coal that comes from 3,000 feet below the surface of the Earth. I mean, and all of these things are suggested by that, and there are people that may dream or they may have a hint of something and think, well, maybe this must have happened, like fundamentalists believe, it couldn't have happened more than 6,000 years ago. That's how old the Earth is, and they'll do everything in the world to try to fit things in that. It doesn't fit. And most anybody and everybody that has had a science education to any extent knows that. But they still keep trying. And there are people that, just will not give that up. There are people that wouldn't believe that the Earth wasn't flat. Most of them were English nobility. For years and years and years. It's profoundly systemic of people to want to cling to ideas that they like, no matter what the evidence is, to contradict them or refute them. And that's a sad thing, but it's amusing to me sometimes to see how far they'll go.
Yeah, I think you're referring to Michael Cremo's book,
Yes, which is very good. It's very good. I've got a copy right here. I like it. There are a lot of things in it that get passed over that suggest very strongly support for many of the things that I've said. But people like to string these things along and make their favorite theory. If it doesn't fit their favorite thesis or whatever, they just pass it off. And that's not the way to grow. The way to grow is you take things as they come and try to fit them. If they don't fit into your particular way of looking at things, then consider it outside your way of looking at things, because there has to be a resolution to this evidence being there. Once you accept that and believe that, then you don't fall into this hole that scientists have been forced into, to just disregard something if it challenges the status quo.
And I've heard you say that we have had 6 previous civilizations that were destroyed when the restraining power of the EMVs was removed from the sun. Can you tell us about that, James?
Well, you get into a cycle where you do the things that you are doing today. This will be the last extinction, so it's very important to give you every possibility for turning things around. You have to learn to outgrow your technology. You have a mindset that, if we don't do this, somebody else will do it first, so you create a hydrogen bomb. Then you create a neutron bomb, and then you go on and on and on. And then you get to a point where everyone loses sight of what's important, what the priorities are. Nature is a priority. The health of the planet is a priority. Making money is not a priority. It's only a priority among people that are obsessed. Not that I wouldn't say that if money represents food for the hungry, that's not a priority. It certainly is. But there shouldn't be any hunger. There shouldn't be any famine. There shouldn't be any disease. We have the technology to eliminate all these, and yet we're spending all this money in research, not in doing that, but in creating more disease, more exotic disease, in the name of weaponizing every damn thing we touch.
I've heard you say that if we don't straighten out, if we don't improve our ways, so to speak, that the earth will be turned into another sun. Can you talk about that?
This will be the last extinction. There's a good chance that in very near future, you're going to destroy yourselves. Russia's drawn a line in the sand over Syria. It better be heeded. Israel and the United States better withdraw from interfering in the civil war there. Pull their mercenaries out and leave those people to determine for themselves what they want. If they weren't supporting the president of Syria the way they are, this would have been over and a done deal long ago. It isn't because he has the people's support. That's a given. So it is too close to Iran. It's too close to the interests of China and Russia to have access to the Middle East, to maintain the economic well-being that they've established based on some of the relationships, the trade relationships they have. You know, the greed and the power hunger of these people that are involved in creating this globalist takeover has gone past the point of any kind of workable, peaceful solution. So right now, we are poised for annihilation because we're dealing with people that are not sane, and they're making the decisions of world leaders. It may be that you destroy yourselves. I put it this way, that right now Jupiter is being terraformed. The moons of Jupiter are all inhabited, and they would appreciate the extra energy from a new sun. That's the nicest way I can put it.
Can you elaborate on that at all? You say the moons of Jupiter are being terraformed?
No, Jupiter is.
Jupiter itself
is being terraformed, yes.
There is going to be a race of people that's going to live on Jupiter itself.
There are people there now.
Now, we hear from conventional science it's just a giant gas ball, right?
Well, what do you hear about the sun? There are people in the sun.
Oh, wow. You got to tell us about this, Steve.
Well, my friend Kevin Smith did a show on structures that had artificial form in the surface of the sun. Not the corona, but in the surface of the sun. Now there is a growing hole there. If you have a technology that's thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years ahead of what we know, how can you perceive it? You can't. So I talk about a simple thing like metal. A metal that can be ionized, a metal that can provide you with everything that you need to be able to travel at any speed, make a right-hand turn, accelerating at any speed, and not feel any difference inside the craft. Now we know that EVs have that ETs have that. Why can't we? It's the metal. The secret is in the metal. So if you have that metal, it would protect you from heat. If you have that metal, you can duplicate any ideal environment you want. You have that metal.
So you're saying there are people dwelling in the sun, and they have this special metal that protects them from the heat of the sun. Why do they prefer to live in the sun?
The energy. They're not so much living, they're working there. They are devising the road amongst planets. They're devising substructure for new stars, suns, different things.
So these people are a much more advanced race than us. They're actually preparing to build solar systems or something of that nature?
Yeah. Well, if you don't survive this lineage, then accommodations will have to be made. If you do survive it, then you're going to need help to clean up and fix this planet. Either way, the options are there to do it.
You know, the Egyptians talked about the sun gods. Are these the same people that you're talking about?
Well, the Egyptians got that from an Etruscan caste, that at the time of when the Upper and Lower Nile came under one kingdom, these people that we call Etruscans after Rome, these people were a priest caste, a very erudite. Well, they were from off Earth, and they wanted to do their part and act as seers and provide a more refined outlook and try to get over the mysticism and the myth-making that early monument builders get into. And so they had continued that influence through Rome, and until the fall of Rome, they were still evident. And now if there's any of them left, they're a very small group.
How did you learn about these people that are residing in the sun?
Well, when I transition, I have to go to the sun and charge up with energy before I can go in an EMV. So I see these people, and I see people that I think have acquired spiritual technology, but I can't talk to them. I try to communicate with them, but they're too snooty.
Is there a land? I mean, is it like a planet inside the sun there? I mean, do people stand on a ground? How does that work? We're taught that the sun is just a fireball, right?
Well, if you will see that show, Kevin has these Soho images of the sun, and you will see these huge buildings, squared off right angles, and be reminded that if these weren't artificial, then they would have to be at fusion temperatures, either gas or liquid. And these aren't gas or liquid, so they have to be artificial. And of course, they're larger than one of these, buildings is larger than 10 Jupiters.
Oh my.
Yeah. That gives them plenty of ability to do all kinds of stuff. When I say create the substructure, the moon has substructure, then they know that. You know, there are a number of astrophysicists and scientists that have been involved in trying to analyze certain things about the moon. They've even published a book on lunar petrology, which I had and sold to a Norwegian scientist. So there's so many things that are kept from the public that it isn't funny, but that you can find out about if you just spend the time. Our sun has a substructure. Some of the facets of that substructure have been evident during some of the phases of solar cycles and so forth, and one was magnified by the intense heat, which will mirror an image and create a magnification effect. But it was a triangle. The substructure looks like a geodesic dome, which is the ideal type of substructure for anything that's round.
So Jupiter has a substructure as well.
Everything that's round in space of mass has a substructure.
How do the people in Jupiter handle the incredible gravity that must exist on that planet?
No problem at all. No problem at all.
Wouldn't it crush an Earth human, you or I?
No. Oh, you have to understand that the power of expectation is an incredible thing. And sometimes you're dealing with changes that have to take place in the individual through generations. Sometimes you are. But as stress mounts on an individual, there are certain things that come to the fore genetically. You have genetic adaptability that's not discussed. They talk about mutation, but there is a genetic adaptability where, under certain conditions, people have genetic patterns that express the trait only, let's say, in a homozygous genetic allele, or pairing, or some other configuration that normally would not be phenotypic, would not exhibit the trait, but will, under certain stresses, that'll happen. And that's the only explanation you can have for this couple that has been discovered that come from Chernobyl and thrive on radiation.
So these people that are residing on the substructure in Jupiter, they've been able to adapt to the incredible gravity. Do they look different than we do?
Sure. Now, I'm talking about people that wanted to adapt. You can always build quarters or an environment that will keep a person from having to adapt. Or you can, if they want to adapt, if they want to be that robust, they can. But, it's not a matter of weaponizing them, like the mindset here. It is a matter of allowing technology and science to work together ethically.
How did you learn about the people on Jupiter?
By being there.
You've been there in a past life?
No.
In this life?
Yeah.
I
remember Shoemaker-Levy?
Yes.
A series that were supposed to have been a comet that disintegrated and from millions and millions of miles in deep space comes in and hits the same target.
Uh-huh.
All these fragments, supposed fragments, in a straight line. Now, if anything breaks up, especially in space, fragments are going to go in every direction, aren't they?
Right.
They don't stay in one line like a choo-choo train and hit the same target. Well, that was the second stage of terraforming. Went right into the eye of a storm there. And, of course, you can call that a furnace, you can call that a mixer, you can call it anything you like, but we're talking about very high level of technology that is making a home, a friendly environment for sentient life, the most complex life there is. Because sentient life demands art and the artifacts of art and a number of other things and growth. So it has to be accommodated. I mean, imagine taking a kid out of this environment that is used to video games and saying, oh, we don't have any video games here. Wouldn't be happy, would he?
So you have been to Jupiter in this lifetime. Can you tell us how you got there?
Travel. I don't sleep. I travel. I lay down, I rest, just like anybody else, because the physical body demands it, but I can also travel. I can do two different kinds of travel. I can phase, and I can auto-project.
James, you're able to travel to Jupiter, and I think you're saying through astral travel, correct?
Well, it's a form of projection. And, of course, if you don't believe that the brain confines the mind, and you know through experience how to use the methods that are already there, that have been supplied, in this case, a form of travel, where I'm taking advantage of changes in time due to misused technology so that I don't harm the continuum, and therefore can utilize compressed time. I could explain this at a level of science where I think anybody could comprehend the principles involved. They're not difficult. I mean, it's not like trying to find a God particle or explain string theory. You know, this is a principle that some pastoral people of a very high technology, not technology, but high culture have. They say, one of the things that I love about them is they say, if a child cannot understand it, it cannot be true. And I love that. I love that. When you begin to understand how legalese and framing words out of ancient languages and trying to speak in terms that are overly specialized just to add to the mystique of science and medicine and so forth, this is priest practice. It isn't medicine. It isn't science. It's trying to make people put something over on people to make them think that you have a privilege or you have an expertise, whether you have it or not.
You know, Jesus said a few things that are quite interesting to me. He said, is it not written in your law that you are all gods? And he also said, greater things will you do than I have done. So is that tie into your being able to travel astrally to Jupiter?
Well, I have been accused of having a Jesus complex. And, of course, my reply to that is if I have to have a complex, that's a pretty damn good one to have. I can't find a single thing wrong morally or in principle with the model of Jesus. And it's very interesting and it's very warming. And, you know, the best theater, the best, most heartwarming stories that are ever put out have a form of moral play. I mean, this will bring a sense of goodness and empathy to the viewer or to the audience that nothing else will. And I'm not an opera fan, but there are plenty of people are because of the emotion that comes through opera is a way that reaches them inside that nothing else does quite as well. Now, I'm not sensitive to that, but I know and recognize that there are people that are. So I kind of wish I did have that quality, but I don't. Maybe it's because that my ear is different.
How is it that you have a Jesus complex?
Well, when I stick to the moral point, whatever the moral premise is, I always stick to it. I always talk about if you take the wrong path, you have to go back to where you took it to take the right path. And that's true of science, true of medicine, it's true of anything. And if you do that, then you can correct all of the perambulations that you have made off the path that have taken you nowhere and created that rabbit hole you're talking about.
It's very interesting. Let me digress back just briefly to the EMVs again. And I wanted to ask you, who built the EMVs?
I don't know. For lack of any better word, let me just say this, God.
Okay.
Like I say, I'm not speaking for God. Look, I am no closer to the face of God than you are.
Very interesting. And I have heard you say, at least I think I've heard you say, that your home that you know of has always been with the EMVs. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes. But I'll say this. If you're in an EMV, whether like me or like spirits, you have access to the universe. There's spirits there in those chambers that I'm not allowed to go into, but that share, that are from all over the universe, and they share everything that's there. And it's simultaneous if that's the way you want it. I mean, it's the most incredible thing there is. I look on you and the people here with envy because, you know, you'll one day be there, and I won't.
Well, why can't you go into those chambers?
I'm part of the task-driven mechanism.
So you're not a typical Earth human.
No, I'm in this mortal shell. I'm here to try to do the best that I can because this is the final extinction and, you know, whatever I can do to help. I had to first convince the extended community that we needed to let this go further, that maybe those decisions that were made on some of those 6 extinctions were premature. You know, and I made my point. The presence of EBs confuses the issue, and split consciousness confuses the issue. And my selling point is so far has been, you know, wouldn't it be incredible if the split consciousness could survive and could adapt to a higher cultural sophistication and go on with all this intensity and creativity that's lacking in unified consciousness? You know, that's a hard sell. But you guys have made me a salesman.
So you are kind of a delegate or an ambassador.
Exactly. I'm a liaison between the EMVs and the ETs.
So I'm still not understanding, though, why you are not allowed in the spirit chambers, but regular Earth humans are. Why would we be different than you in that sense?
Well, I don't even know that I have a soul. I don't know.
So
I'm designed like the EMVs to be, to fulfill what I'm supposed to fulfill and not be corrupted.
So do you consider yourself like a biological android or something like that?
No. Don't think I haven't thought about it many times. If I could come up with an answer, I wouldn't hesitate to give it to you. But all I can do is about myself because really I've always before until this time around, I've always before just been left out of the equation, just been someone that would represent the EMVs and whatever the ETs as a group, an extended community we call them. And there are many extended communities. What they would come about to decide, and I would listen, and if there was a very, very strong agreement, And it was, I felt, as humane on one hand as it had to be and as practical on the other as it had to be. I would go along with the program. But this time I didn't do that. So I was criticized, having gone native, looked upon as a pariah. But, there was nothing that compelled me to be anything other than what I thought I should be or do differently this time, to see if something that has variation that could be precious to the universe can be salvaged out of this.
James, it's so interesting to talk to you and to be able to hear about this new information. You always have layers and layers and layers of information, and it's astonishing, and I appreciate you sharing so much this evening. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. You mentioned to me the other day in one of our off-the-air conversations that you were making some kind of comparison between Richard Hoagland and Dr. Berggren, and I wondered if you could kind of follow up on that discussion.
Well, once you realize that Hoagland was a science editor, he was a science consultant for Walter Cronkite, who was a New World Order advocate. And he has taken the example of Cydonia, and he's right about Cydonia. Much of what he says is true. But when they falsely represented in resolution the face on Cydonia as a pile of rubble, he should have spoke up, and he didn't. When Dr. Berggren wrote his book, he should have commented on it, and he should have examined it for what it was worth and decided whether he was going to support it or not neglected it entirely, ignored it entirely, and rebuffed Dr. Berggren's attempts to approach him, which he did. Since then, other things have struck me about Richard Hoagland that have suggested to me that he's not what he pretends. And I draw some issues with him, and I take issues with him. I think that he has become an alarmist. He was talking about the floor of the Gulf of Mexico being an asbestos volcano. He was talking about Elenin being a time capsule, the one thing and another. And he's not the only one in the alternative, quote, unquote, community that does this sort of thing. Like they were trying to get a new script and new ideas, new billboard for the sensational to draw an audience. But this is what I call a cottage industry. They have built up a dependence on money out of ufology, out of anomaly research or whatever. They've got a conflict of interest. They're not truth seekers. And they find that their interests, their own self-interests, align with being gatekeepers, with containing, just like the mass media and NASA and other groups that want to bottle in reality to where people can't look at the possibilities and consider them and build a model around possibility when nothing else works.
James, are you aware of Dr. Tom Van Flandern?
Yes, I am.
Have you heard of the crown face?
Some mention of it. There's so much. Would you go into detail about what you want to talk about it?
Sure. Everyone's heard probably in this field of the face at Cydonia. Dr. Tom Van Flandern was the head of celestial mechanics for the Navy. He was an astronomer, and he showed these incredible pictures. The most incredible picture I've ever seen from Mars is what they call the crown face, which was this absolutely clear sculpture on the ground of Mars of a humanoid face with a crown on it. And there was absolutely no way that you could mistake it for anything else. And I just wondered if you had heard of that before.
Yes. There's so many things on Mars. When you were a youngster, did you ever go out arrowhead hunting or looking over old dumps or anything, and you came home with your pockets filled of stuff and your mother made you throw it all away and stuff like that? Well, if you were on Mars, you were walking around on Mars, that would happen to you there too. There are places where there are excavations. I'm very fond of Kevin Smith, who takes NASA images and finds these things in them. And then, NASA applies this red filter to everything that distorts detail because it got you convinced that it's a red planet. It's not a red planet. And all this to make it removed from your reality as much as possible. You can breathe on Mars. It wouldn't be that labored. Kevin's last show on Mars showed a stream, running water. Yeah, in fact, there was geologists that called up and said, yeah, I agree with you. That's a stream of running water. Like I said, there was a vast system of canals that were present and observable with the naked eye, and well, let's say with a 20-power binocular or even less on Mars up until the mid-30s. They were called canali, and they were very evident, and that made H.G. Wells' rendition of what Orson Welles portrayed in his radio show so real to people because, they had talked about the canali, they knew about it, but what you have today is you have history being lost, falling through the cracks, and there are CIA people that just go out and buy up stuff. They buy up magazines that have articles that they don't want people to remember or know anything about, books, et cetera, et cetera. They've got people that they pay that are readers that read novels. Oh, this novel, we don't want this novel promoted. Movies, there was one movie made on chemtrails back in 2007 called Toxic Skies. It was banned in the United States, but it was a Hollywood movie. So there are so many things that people forget, that like that documentary about that UN colonel that I was telling you about. That's fascinating, the most fascinating documentary I've ever seen on television. And yet the amazing thing about that is that all these anthropologists that were involved in this were just so elated and so mystified and so fascinated by the fact that they had found an example of Stone Age trephining that lasted into present times. And this is just... Do you think that at any time they said, well, how in the devil can this guy be a genius? No brain above the brain pan. You think they ever did that?
No, they probably didn't. That's quite sad. That's astonishing.
That is the state of medical science, if you want to call it that, and of the natural sciences and the whole 9 yards. I mean, it's pathetic. And, I'm just sitting there, shaking my head. Could say, I wish I was there. I wish I was there.
Huh. What you were saying about people from various government agencies buying up things and trying to hide history.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. I have a book.
They call them readers. They call them readers. That's really what they do.
I have a book called UFO Contact from the Pleiades by Colonel Wendell Stevens. And it's an astonishing book. It has some fascinating information in it. But you can't find Colonel Stevens's books anymore unless you might find them for $300 or $400 or $500 at some places, on the internet. But that's about it. So I think they are actively trying to stifle a lot of this information.
Well, there was a book that came out in the 80s called Trafficking. Now, it's not anything to do with the movie that's entitled Trafficking. This book is not fiction, and it's about Air America. And I used to sell books online. So I got a copy of this and would research them, and I researched this book. It pops up, and there is no copy online with price. Finally, I do find out that years ago, one was sold for $700. Now, this is a book that wasn't 20 years old, or much more than 20 years old, and disappeared. I'll give you an example. In 1909, the greatest military genius of the 20th century, Homer Lee, published The Ignorance of Valor, which laid out, he was fearful of the Japanese doing exactly what they did. He wrote this book as a wake-up call to show what the Japanese would do if they decided to be after world domination, like with the Germans or any other allies. And so he laid out the invasion plans in the Pacific, the Philippine Islands, everything. And when the book was published, there were, I think, 40,000 copies or 20,000 copies. All of a sudden, they just start disappearing. The Japanese embassy's buying up every single one they can get their hands on. And today, a first edition, which I have one, is extremely rare. It was been reprinted, and it was used as a text at West Point for a long time because, like I said, Homer Lee was a military genius. He was offered the supreme command of all land forces by the Dowager Empress in China, and he was offered the supreme command of all land forces in Russia by the Tsar. And he opted to take the command of all land forces under the Dowager Empress, and in the front of his book is a picture of him in the uniform of Supreme Commander of all land forces for the Dowager Empress in China. Quite something. And, of course, he couldn't get into West Point because he was a hunchback. Isn't that fascinating?
Yes. Very interesting.
He was kind of strange. In his view, in his worldview, the menace would not be the Chinese or black people or anything like that. The menace was going to be Slavic people. So the final work, I don't know how far he got into it or whatever, but we're Slavs. This was the next people to fear. But he absolutely was a genius, military genius. I would put him on par with Napoleon.
I wanted to share with you, and I may have already told you this at some other time, and I know I've mentioned it before on some of my shows, but one of the fascinating stories in Colonel Wendell Stevens' book, Contact from the Pleiades, A Preliminary Investigation, is the story about a man named Dr. Lawrence Kennedy, who was in Zosar's pyramid, which is the step pyramid there in Egypt, the smaller one. He got to see a chamber that was not available to the public, and they have a mural on that chamber that shows a cylinder-shaped craft, a couple smaller craft, and the Giza complex, and in the hieroglyphics under it, it talks about people who came here from the stars and visited the people in Egypt. I just wanted to share that with you. That one story pretty much blows the whole cover up, in my opinion.
Well, there are a number of them. There was a contingent, an expedition of ETs that set up in the Grand Canyon. And they carved out all these rooms and chambers in the rock. And they had their power supply down in the lower levels. And they had a battery salt that was extracted from that find. And what advanced the batteries that are running these probes that are running indefinitely, and rovers that are running indefinitely. They're supposed to have lost power long ago, and they're still going strong. And that battery salt came from that find in the Grand Canyon. Then there was a dynasty in Egypt that had a bloodline, an ET bloodline, and these were the elongated heads. The headdress was designed during that period to hide that elongated head. And, of course, it stayed in fashion all the way up to the Ptolemaic dynasty and beyond to Cleopatra, who was Ptolemy.
And where were these people with elongated heads from, do you know?
Yeah, but they're still around, and I don't want to talk about them because I look at it like this. With ETs that are here, and figure that when they want to, they'll come up, shake your hand, and talk to you, tell you about themselves. I will talk about the Druge, the Abroid, because they're gone. I'll talk about the Blondes because they are here. This is where they came from. This is their home, just as like it's yours. People that are members of the extended community, with the exception of the Blondes that are too, I don't like to talk about because they're not going to talk about me. They're not going to talk to you about me, and I return the favor. And the reason for that is that's an understanding that goes back a long, long time ago. We don't like to interfere with the normal trends and evolution of a culture until we have to. I have felt since the last few years that I wanted to change the protocol. And I have for my sake, and I want for them. I know that there, like for instance, there are people I didn't know that are from outside, that are from deep space, that conducted the flap in Colares, Brazil. They were concerned. They had picked up enough knowledge and enough data about what was going on here to be concerned and wanting to know what was going on and if this species was impaired. So they selected a village, what you would call an experiment. And they probed everyone in that village over a period of months. This was extraordinary. This is probably the most extraordinary UFO flap on record. And it opened up the files, military and government files on UFOs in Brazil to ufologists. There has been disclosure in Brazil. You just don't hear about it because ufologists here don't even talk about this. And now, with some of these people that are trying to build this hostile alien thesis, they're trying to make this out as an example of hostile ETs. It wasn't hostile. In fact, while it was ongoing, the Brazilian military sent a military contingent down to study it. While it was ongoing, there was a lieutenant who was in charge of it, and one night when he's sleeping in his tent, he was visited by an ET, and this guy was wearing a lead mask to protect him from his energy field. These were advanced, very advanced. He tells him, he said, "We're not here to mean anyone any harm." That's what he said. Of course, the officer kept quiet about this, and after 20-some-odd years or so, he came forward, and he contacted ufologists. He was an excellent artist, and he drew some of the craft. They had all kinds of different craft. They would come in at night. They hit a person with this probe light, probe them, and sometimes they'd take biopsies. They didn't abduct them, but they would be pretty rigid, and they would be in a trance-like state while this was going on, which was be a very short period of time, and then maybe hit 2 or 3 more that night, go on until they had hit the whole village. They even hit the doctor, who thought everyone was in hysteria until it happened to her. These people were concerned and trying to figure out if there's anything that they might do, that they might reverse what they could see was inevitable. These people were from way out there, and eventually I found another incident that happened in Switzerland that I think was done by the same people. And in this case, this one person they wanted to deal with, they said, "Would you like us to move your car?" And he said, "Yeah." So the car disappeared and appeared somewhere else in the blink of an eye. And they were just demonstrating that they were a high-level technology. And, of course, after it was all over, this fellow took pictures. And that's a long story, and I would tell you more, but I'm not at liberty to. This happened some time ago, and I wish they had come forward, but they haven't, and they have been harassed, and they have had a lot of things happen to them, MIBs, the whole 9 yards. So it's very confusing to them, but one of them is a friend of mine. Now, he wasn't directly involved, but it's his friend that was, and he's seen the pictures and shared them. But this was another extraordinary event. And anything that demonstrates the vast superiority of these ETs, and yet they're friendly, they're not hostile, is the last thing that the powers that be want you to experience or have any information to pass on to anybody else, because they're waiting to build the ET into a fear. So that'll be the final step. We have to do this. We have to do that. You have to buy all these more bullets. Remember? So we can save you from mean old hostile ET. That's all a fabrication. And it's been discussed by these think tanks that have set it up now for 40 years, 50 years.
It's very interesting. You know, recently we've had the citizens hearing on disclosure. And, you know, if you're like you and I, when I watch that, to me it's kind of very unspectacular. And there's been so many of these extraordinary events that have occurred in this field that people just don't know about.
Well, they know about them. They know about, I know that you are involved in exopolitics. And so you know that I differ with a lot of people that are, even some of the bigwigs, like Dr. Greer and Alfred Labramont Weber. This is the way I look at it, and I am not going to say this is the way it is out of respect for you, because I know that you deal with these people, and I respect that, and I respect you. But either wittingly or unwittingly, they're being used to lay the ground for a credibility they have denied. The powers that be have denied, suppressed, murdered, killed, burdened people to suppress now for 50, 60 years. Now, all of a sudden, They've got to build a credibility base and at the same time not show themselves as the criminals they were to do all this. They committed crimes. So they use people like Dr. Greer, people like Alfred, they use them to lay the groundwork for them because they can still maintain the deniability, can't they?
Yes.
So it's a ploy. And that doesn't mean that Dr. Greer or that Alfred is involved in the deception. But it is how they're being used. You know, I look at it this way. If people get promotion, if they're promoted, if they even come close to being written about in the mass media, be suspicious. Be very suspicious.
You know, it's interesting. I was eating dinner today with my wife and we were at a restaurant and they have these big screen TVs up. And just to my right was this show playing and it's a new show out. I think they had a season premiere. It was 2 hours long and it's called Falling Skies. And it's about, you know, ETs. I mean, the sound was off, but I can see human beings walking around with rifles. And then next thing I know, they have this jail set up and they've got these kind of strange looking ETs in this jail and it's all the same. You know, we've seen Battle LA, we've seen Independence Day.
Cowboys and aliens. That's the most ridiculous thing I ever saw.
A society's being molded right now. These ideas are being put in our subconscious, don't you think?
Oh, yeah. People need to step back and realize, and not all the astronomers have played to the deception. Even the worst of the deceivers, Carl Sagan, has come out from time to time and said things that were true. You know, maybe by mistake. But he's talked about if there was contact, they would probably, based on the rapidity of how fast when you get to a certain level that you acquire almost in geometric proportions, you acquire higher and higher technology after a certain point. And that's true. That is very true. And so if you have, say, a civilization that is 5,000 years older, that has gone 5,000 years ahead of where we are now, and survives its technology, well, it has already accomplished mastery over its star. And it is ready to go further. You know, maybe build a solar anvil, maybe build a number of other things. They're getting near being able to figure out what I've discussed. There are all kinds of mistakes that have been made in the classifying of the elements into the periodic chart of the elements. And a lot of this was deception, intended deception. So you get that straightened out and you turn scientists loose, where they're not under the constrainment of compartmentalization and security classification and just told if you don't lie, you'll lose your job or worse. And you throw information out into the public because you have got unpronounced genius out there that can take and run with stuff. I mean, you cannot presume on genius any more than you can presume on advanced technologies. You can't do it. You can't even perceive of what some of these kids today might be able to do if they were given anything like the truth where they could obtain clarity about things, because we have kids who can do things with computers that, man, I can't do. And we have things with we have kids today that, you know, sit around and they do this humdrum thing over and over again because there's nothing else to do. You give them things. I mean, you can make video games that will take a kid, and I'm talking about an 8-year-old, right on through all the math that they could get right up to a PhD in physics. In a game that you create, where they have to use all these formulas in order to hit this tank that's moving at a rate of speed and changing speed, changing gears and everything, and they got to figure out where that shell that they're going to fire, the trajectory and everything, in order to hit it with all the gyrations it's doing. I mean, there's so many ways and things to turn these beautiful young minds into gold. I mean, so many things, but that's not what education today is about. And it's programming. That's what it's about.
I wanted to get back just a second to the hostile alien thesis. I always thought it was strange that these ETs would wait for us to get things like the atomic bomb before they invaded,
And turn the Earth into a garbage dump. Pesticides in the most remote areas of the ocean, there are these hunks of goo, which are killing coral and marine life left and right from our throwaway plastic.
Right. Very, very true.
This could be changed, but and we could develop the technology to do it, but there's no emphasis. There's no priority to do so. Right now we have a government that is sold out to a company obsessed in the same way that pharmaceuticals are, that unless we can make it synthetically, we're not going to allow it to be marketed. And they want to do this to our food, Monsanto. They're killing our bees. They're trying to make laws that you can't keep heritage seed. They're driving farmers out of business left and right with the marketing techniques. This is a far greater threat to human life on this planet than any other single thing right now, with the exception of what's going on in the Middle East, of course. That's either going to be resolved soon or who knows what will happen. I shudder to think. Don't you?
Yeah, I do. So you think we're at risk for a World War III?
Yeah.
General Wesley Clark has an interesting video on YouTube where he says that in 2001 he saw a top secret document that basically outlined all of these countries that we would be at war with for the next 5 to 10 years. And sure enough, they're following their script.
They're following the script, and they better pull up. Because to think that they can overpower countries like China and Russia that have as much at stake in the Middle East as we have, to think that they can just overpower them and take over border nations. We didn't have a missile crisis until we put IRCBMs in Turkey. And then the Soviets decided, well, we'll put them in Cuba. And basically, as far as geography goes, it's about the same thing. But you see, the closer that you get them to your target, the less warning, if you launch, the less warning the enemy has. And so it's critical. But, to do a stupid thing, to raise the notch up, you're giving your enemy the same provocation. So we ask for that. And, thank God JFK understood that much better than his chief of staff, military chief of staff, who urged him to release against the Soviet Union over the Cuban Missile Crisis. We came awfully close there.
Iran will not be a pushover. They have some very high technology.
They have something that, if you could appeal to Netanyahu at all, if he was sane, and he's not, there's already been enough demonstrated to him to pull in his horns, and he wouldn't have attacked Syria here a couple of weeks ago. But no. Which shows to me that he has no more common sense than a bedbug, and he is the part of the equation that I worry about. Because if they go to conventional war with Russia over Syria, then the Russians will overwhelm him, and then he may resort to releasing nukes against Russia. And I'm not so certain that Obama is that much more stable than Netanyahu. And it's all over if the United States releases against Russia. It's all over. And, of course, Netanyahu has said that if Israel goes, the world will go because we'll release against the major powers.
Now, Israel does not allow weapons inspectors, do they?
No, they don't comply with any non-proliferation treaty whatsoever and never have. Never have. And the United States has let them get away with it time in and time again. But there are things I could tell you that I'm not going to. Things that I know that they don't know. Israel has already tried to release once.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Nothing would work. Netanyahu gets on a plane and flies to Russia without any diplomatic pouch. Could have been arrested and put in prison. Storms in on Putin and raving and ranting because he felt that only two countries in the world that could have that kind of technology were either Russia or the United States, and he knew that the United States was in his hip pocket. Putin, of course, doesn't have any idea what he's talking about, and Netanyahu figures that out before he gets very far in his raving and ranting, and bows out by saying, oh, well, you won't give us permission to attack Iran? And Putin says, of course not.
What does Israel have to gain by attacking Iran?
They are obsessed. Israel is a very dangerous, unstable quantity in the equation. Unpredictable. They have no moral stance whatsoever against the people, the Palestinians in Gaza. They've created a ghetto of the worst kind. They didn't want those people to have fresh water. They didn't want them to have food. They didn't want to have medicine. And they punished Egypt whenever Egypt provided the corridor for these people to get these things. And that's part of why the Egyptian government had all the turmoil and conflict that they had. But you see, Israel has been a bulldog for the Seven Sisters, the big oil, for so long, in keeping the Arab states from any kind of unity. They fear a united Arab republic like Nasser had begun, because the last thing they want the Arab people to do is to use their own resources, go through their own industrial revolution, and, build up internal projects like the Aswan Dam that Nasser built.
And a lot of people don't realize that Israel they have a lot of nukes. They have all kinds of weapons.
Yeah, and most of these were acquired illicitly. We had companies that would barrel up plutonium waste from reactors and take them by freighter to the Atlantic Trough to dump them in. And Israel would pirate these barrels of plutonium waste, take them to Israel, and high-grade the plutonium waste. One of the things they don't tell you is that any kind of spent rod that comes out of the core of a reactor can be reprocessed, reconcentrated, and reused, and it would save billions of dollars. But they're not interested in doing that. There have been experts talk about this. The reality is you can have even a fast breeder reactor built safely if everyone will conform to standards.
I think we're out of time, James. Thanks so much for coming on. It's been a fantastic conversation, sure.
Well, thank you, Mark.
Talk to you next time. Thanks, everybody, for listening. This is OhioExopolitics. I'm your host, Mark Snider. Good evening.